February 1945. The Third Reich is dying. Soviet armies hammer at the gates of Berlin. American and British bombers turn German cities into ruins. The 1,000-year Reich that was promised will barely last 12 years. But in the frigid waters off the Norwegian coast, one last gamble is about to begin. A mission so secret, so potentially devastating, that its discovery will trigger the largest submarine hunt in naval history. This is the story of U-864, a Type IXD-2 U-boat carrying cargo that could have altered the balance of power in the Pacific War and extended the agony of World War II by months, perhaps years. It is a story of revolutionary technology, desperate men, and a cat-and-mouse game played 300 feet beneath storm-racked seas, where a single mistake meant death for 65 souls. The mission was codenamed Operation Caesar. Its objective: to deliver advanced German military technology to Imperial Japan, jet engine designs, radar plans, optical equipment, and 65 tons of liquid mercury for weapons production. If successful, it could give Japan the means to continue fighting long after Germany's inevitable collapse. But hunting U-864 was HMS Venturer, a British submarine whose captain would attempt something never done before or since: sinking an enemy submarine while both vessels were completely submerged. This is the story of two submarines, two captains, and two nations racing against time in the frozen depths of the North Atlantic. Act 1. The Super U-Boat. U-864 was no ordinary submarine. She was a Type IXD-2 cruiser U-boat designed for long-range patrols that could take her around the globe. At 294 feet long, with a beam of 20 feet, she was massive by U-boat standards, almost 50 feet longer than the more common Type 7 boats that prowled the Atlantic. But what made U-864 truly revolutionary wasn't her size. It was what German engineers had installed in her hull during a special modification at the Germaniawerft shipyard in Kiel: a Walter turbine propulsion system. Dr. Helmuth Walter's invention was decades ahead of its time. Unlike conventional diesel-electric submarines that could only manage 7 to 8 knots submerged, the Walter turbine used hydrogen peroxide decomposition to drive a steam turbine, theoretically allowing underwater speeds of up to 25 knots, faster than most surface warships. A U-boat equipped with this technology would be nearly uncatchable when submerged, revolutionizing submarine warfare. The installation, however, had been plagued with problems. The hydrogen peroxide fuel was viciously corrosive and unstable. During trials, leaks had caused fires and explosions. The system was temperamental, dangerous, and not yet fully reliable. But time was running out for Germany, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The man chosen to command this experimental boat was Corvettan Captain Ralph Reimar Wolfram, a 32-year-old career naval officer with ice-blue eyes and a reputation for both competence and caution. Wolfram knew the odds. In early 1945, U-boat crews had roughly a 75% casualty rate. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of submarines, hunted by Allied destroyers, aircraft, and increasingly sophisticated sonar. His crew of 65 men was a mixture of veterans and teenagers, boys barely old enough to shave pressed in his service as the Kriegsmarine scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. They loaded their deadly cargo in December 1944, wooden crates containing blueprints for the Me-262 jet fighter, radar designs, infrared weapon sights, and specialized optical equipment. In the bilges, workers carefully secured 65 tons of liquid mercury in special containers. Mercury that would be used in Japanese weapons production and in the manufacture of mercury fulminate for explosive primers. Also aboard were 2 passengers, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine technical specialists who would train Japanese engineers in using the transferred technology. These men carried in their heads knowledge that could prolong the Pacific War indefinitely. The mission parameters were clear but daunting. Sail from Kiel around the northern tip of Norway, traverse the entire Atlantic, round the Cape of Good Hope, cross the Indian Ocean, and reach the Japanese naval base at Penang, Malaysia, a journey of over 15,000 miles through Allied-controlled waters. U-864 departed Kiel on December 5, 1944, sliding beneath the gray Baltic waters as snow fell on the devastated city. It would be the last time most of her crew would see Germany. Act 2. Death in Norwegian waters. The voyage began badly and got worse. Within days of departure, the experimental Walter turbine began showing problems. Temperature gauges spiked. Pressure readings fluctuated wildly. The hydrogen peroxide fuel corroded seals and gaskets. Wolfram made the agonizing decision to abort the mission and limp to the Norwegian port of Bergen for repairs. For 2 months, U-864 sat in Bergen while engineers struggled with the temperamental propulsion system. 2 precious months while Allied intelligence networks watched and reported. 2 months during which the British Admiralty became aware that something unusual was happening at Bergen. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had picked up fragments of information about a special U-boat mission. They didn't know the details, but they knew enough. A large U-boat was preparing for a long-range mission, possibly to the Far East. The cargo was suspected to be advanced technology or weapons materials. The order went out. U-864 must not reach open ocean. She must be found and destroyed. On February 5th, 1945, repairs finally complete, Wolfram took U-864 to sea again, heading north along the Norwegian coast toward the Arctic. The plan was to slip through the narrow channels between the Norwegian mainland and the offshore islands, then break out into the open Atlantic through the Fredbergen Passage. But the British were waiting. Act 3. The Hunter. HMS Venture was a British V-class submarine, smaller and less sophisticated than U-864, but commanded by one of the Royal Navy's most skilled submarine captains, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Launders, a 25-year-old prodigy who had already sunk 1 U-boat and numerous surface vessels. Launders received his orders on February 6th. Proceed to the waters off Fedge Island and intercept U-864. Intelligence suggested the German submarine would attempt to break out in the next 48 hours. Find her, sink her, at all costs, prevent her from reaching the Atlantic. There was just one problem. The Norwegian coastal waters were a nightmare of navigation. Narrow channels between rocky islands, swift currents, unpredictable weather, and in February, nearly perpetual darkness punctuated by vicious storms. Finding another submarine in these conditions would be like finding a grain of sand on a beach at night while wearing a blindfold. But Launders had something U-864 didn't. He knew approximately where his prey would be, and he had exceptional sonar operators who could distinguish between whales, schools of fish, surface ships, and submarines based on the faintest acoustic signatures. Venture arrived in the patrol area on February 8th and began the wait. The submarine lay on the bottom in 200 feet of water, conserving battery power, listening. The hydrophone operators sat in absolute silence, headphones pressed to their ears, filtering out the sounds of waves, marine life, and distant shipping. Above them, a winter storm lashed the North Sea. 50-foot waves crashed against the rocky islands. The wind howled at 60 knots. It was perfect weather for a submarine trying to slip through undetected. The storm noise would mask engine sounds and make sonar detection nearly impossible. But it was also perfect weather for a submarine lying in wait. The storm would force any vessel, including U-864, to stay relatively deep to avoid the surface turbulence. And in these narrow channels, there were only so many routes a deep-draft submarine could take. Launders studied his charts obsessively. If he were commanding U-864, where would he go? Which channel offered the deepest water? Which route avoided the most dangerous rocks and shoals? He made his choice and positioned Venture accordingly. Now came the hardest part, waiting in absolute silence while breathing recycled air that smelled of diesel fuel. Unwashed bodies and fear. Act 4. The Acoustic Duel. February 9th, 1945, 10 o'clock hours. The storm was beginning to moderate slightly. Inside Venture, the hydrophone operator suddenly stiffened. He held up his hand for silence, adjusted his equipment, listened intently. Contact, he whispered. Bearing 270. Sounds like diesel engines. Submerged. Range unknown. Launders was at his side instantly. He He took the headphones and listened. There, beneath the wash of waves and the creaking of Venturer's own hull, was the rhythmic thrum of diesel engines and the swish of propellers. A submarine running submerged on electric motors with diesels engaged a snorkel, recharging batteries while staying underwater. It had to be U-864. There were no other Allied submarines in this area, and German surface ships wouldn't be operating in these narrow channels during a storm. Battle stations, Launders ordered quietly. Rig for silent running. Load all tubes. The crew moved like ghosts through the submarine. Men took their positions without speaking. In the torpedo room, 4 Mark 8 torpedoes were prepared for firing. But firing torpedoes at an underwater target presented a problem that had never been solved in combat. Surface ships were easy targets relatively. They moved predictably, and torpedoes could be aimed based on visual sightings or radar. But a submerged submarine? It could be at any depth between 50 and 300 feet. It could change course at any moment. It was invisible except for the acoustic signature picked up by hydrophones. And those hydrophones couldn't give precise range, only bearing and approximate distance. To sink U-864, Launders would have to calculate the German submarine's exact course, speed, and depth based purely on sound. Then he would have to estimate where U-864 would be when the torpedoes reached it. A moving three-dimensional calculation made infinitely more complex by ocean currents, the torpedo's own running characteristics, and the possibility that Wolfram might detect the torpedo attack and take evasive action. It was, quite simply, almost impossible. But Launders was about to attempt it anyway. Act 5, The Mathematics of Death. For 4 hours, Venturer shadowed U-864. Launders couldn't get closer. The risk of being detected was too high. He couldn't surface to use his periscope. U-864 would see him immediately. He could only listen and plot. His officers worked continuously at the plotting table, tracking every minute change and bearing. Gradually, a picture emerged. U-864 was proceeding northwest at approximately 5 knots, depth estimated at 90 to 100 feet, probably running on electric motors now to reduce noise as she approached the open Atlantic. But there was something odd about the German submarine's movement. Every 20 minutes or so, she would make a slight zigzag, standard anti-submarine procedure to throw off any pursuing torpedo. Wolfram wasn't taking any chances, even though he had no reason to believe he was being followed. Those zigzags were actually a gift to Launders. They allowed him to calculate U-864's pattern. If he could predict when the next zigzag would occur, he could position his torpedoes accordingly. At 12 hours, Launders made his decision. Range approximately 1,500 yards. Target bearing 345 degrees. Estimated depth 100 feet. Course approximately 315 degrees, speed 5 knots. Standby tubes 1 through 4, he ordered. Will fire a spread pattern. Set running depth 95 feet. Spread the fan to account for the zigzag pattern. His executive officer looked at him with barely concealed doubt. They were about to fire 4 precious torpedoes at a target they couldn't see, based purely on acoustic bearings and mathematical calculations. The chances of a hit seemed infinitesimally small. Fire 1, Launders said calmly. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air expelled each torpedo from its tube. 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each carrying 750 pounds of Torpex explosive, began their run through the dark water. Torpedoes running true, the hydrophone operator reported. Time to target, approximately 5 minutes. Now came the longest 5 minutes of every man's life. Aboard Venturer, the crew held their breath. There was nothing more they could do. The torpedoes were running. U-864's fate was sealed, one way or another. Act 6, the final dive. Aboard U-864, the mood was cautiously optimistic. They had made it through the most dangerous part of the Norwegian coastal passage. Open ocean was only a few miles ahead. Once there, they could dive deep and run fast, leaving the shallow coastal waters and their dangers behind. Corvette Captain Wolfram stood in the control room, monitoring the boat's systems. The Walter turbine was behaving itself. Finally, they had fuel, food, and ammunition. The mission could still succeed. Then, at 12:16 hours, the hydrophone operator's face went white. "Propeller sounds," he shouted. "Multiple contacts. Bearing 160, closing fast. Torpedoes in the water." Wolfram's blood turned to ice. His mind raced through options in microseconds. Surface? No time. Dive deeper? The torpedoes would follow. Turn toward the torpedoes to minimize the target profile? Possibly their only chance. "Hard right rudder," he barked. "Emergency dive. All ahead full. Take us to 150 meters." U-864 heeled over as her rudders bit into the water. The electric motors screamed to maximum power. The diving planes angled down sharply. Men grabbed for handholds as the deck tilted, but they were seconds too late. Launders had calculated the pattern perfectly. His spread of torpedoes covered all likely escape routes. At 12:17 hours, the first torpedo passed harmlessly ahead of U-864's bow. Wolfram's turn had just barely thrown off its track. The second torpedo missed astern by 20 yards. The third torpedo, however, struck U-864 midships at 12:17 and 45 seconds, its magnetic detonator triggering as it passed under the submarine's keel. The explosion was catastrophic. The pressure hull ruptured. Seawater poured in with hydraulic force. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Emergency lighting flickered and died. Wolfram tried to give orders, but there were no longer enough men alive to follow them. The fourth torpedo hit 15 seconds later, breaking U-864's back. The submarine, her cargo of deadly secrets, and 65 souls began the long fall to the seafloor, 500 feet below. Epilogue: The Ghost That Never Was. Aboard HMS Venturer, the hydrophone operator reported hearing the unmistakable sounds of a submarine breaking up, bulkheads collapsing, air escaping, metal groaning under impossible pressure. Then silence. "Target destroyed," he said quietly. Launders allowed himself a moment of relief, then ordered Venturer to retire from the area at maximum speed. They had accomplished something unprecedented. The only submarine versus submarine kill, while both vessels were completely submerged, achieved through a combination of mathematics, intuition, and extraordinary skill. The wreck of U-864 lay undiscovered for decades, resting in two pieces on the Norwegian seabed. When she was finally located in 2003, Norwegian authorities faced a dilemma. The 65 tons of liquid mercury in her cargo hold were slowly leaking, creating an environmental hazard that persists to this day. Operation Caesar died with U-864. The technology she carried, jet engine designs, radar plans, optical equipment, never reached Japan. Would it have changed the outcome of the Pacific War? Probably not. By February 1945, Japan was already doomed, but it might have extended the war by months, costing thousands more lives. Lieutenant James Launders survived the war and retired as a Royal Navy commander. He rarely spoke about the sinking of U-864, perhaps understanding that his greatest achievement was also the death of 65 men who were simply following orders. Corvette Captain Ralph Reimar Wolfram and his crew remain entombed in their submarine, 300 miles from the Germany they would never see again. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by grand fleet actions or dramatic last stands, but by engagements like this, silent, invisible battles fought in the cold depths where only the sonar operators and the fish bore witness. U-864 was just one of over 700 German U-boats lost during World War II. But her mission represented something uniquely dangerous: the possibility of prolonging a war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives. That HMS Venturer stopped her is one of the forgotten turning points of history. A mission that failed because one submarine captain was just a little bit better at three-dimensional calculus than another, and because 4 torpedoes found their mark in the dark waters off Norway. The Ghost of the Atlantic never reached her destination, and the world, unknowing, was spared the consequences of Operation Caesar's success.